So, in the previous segment, we had actually considered the link between colonialism and imperialism. And what I had told you was that imperialism is the larger process and colonialism is a smaller subset of the process, right? We can also think about this in temporal terms, right? So, certainly, one sequence of events that we are familiar with is that first you have this kind of imperialism or an imperial drive, for instance, like the one we saw amongst European countries in the 1700s, which may or may not result in colonial control, where these countries go ahead and set up their own colonies. Okay, but certainly, interestingly, we may see a cycle in the relationship between colonialism and imperialism. So, for instance, when we look at the colonial history of the world, we see that, particularly with the European countries, what happened was that, there is an age, there's in some ways a golden age of European imperialism where these countries are rushing to exert imperial control. At some point, they also all start to develop their own colonies. And then there is a wave of back to imperialism where they give up the colonies and go back to imperial control. Okay, so actually, when we look at the history of colonialism, we see that it's split into actually two periods. It starts off in the 15th century, and at this point in time, the major colonial powers were the two European states of Spain and Portugal. By the 1820s, the situation changes. Okay, so over time, what happens is that the influence of Spain and Portugal as countries that have their own colonies declines, and there are other countries that come up as great colonial powers, as great colonial centers, which have many colonies around the world. And these are the countries of Britain, France, Germany, US, and Japan. Okay, this kind of from the 1820s on till the Second World War is where we see the second wave of colonialism coming up. Okay, we should also keep in mind that amongst this list of countries, we would also include countries like USSR and China, which had their colonies in different parts. Now, what we have heard of colonialism is that it's a very sort of actually a rather oppressive relationship. However, I think different means were used to justify the colonial exercise of colonial power. In fact, one of the common ways in which colonialism was justified was that it is something that is being done for the benefit of the people who are being colonized themselves. So, for instance, in this image you see in front of you, you will see that this is an actual cartoon from the late 1800s. Where you see there are two figures which represent the US and the UK. Okay, and these two figures are carrying baskets. These are actually seats where there are a variety of people representing different parts of the world sitting on their shoulders. So you have people from Cuba, from other parts of Africa. You have on the shoulder of the American guy, and on the shoulder of the British representative, you have China, you have India, you have Turkey, so on and so forth, right? And they are being shown as jumping across huge rocks, and the names of the rocks are very interesting: oppression, vice, superstition, brutality. And they're going up a hill. They're carrying all of these people on their backs up the hill to reach the pinnacle, the top of the hill, which is civilization. Okay, now this is an image which is the title of the image itself is The White Man's Burden, and actually it was a very popular sort of understanding of the colonial relationship. Okay, so the idea was that as per this understanding of colonialism, the interpretation was that the colonial power is establishing colonies all across the world because it wants to help all these people who are less civilized to become civilized. Okay, so in other words, it's a very sort of altruistic project being undertaken by these colonial powers to civilize people from uncivilized parts of the world. Okay, so you remember in the previous segment we had talked about media imperialism. This is, I think, one of the early sort of forms of media imperialism, right? So justifying the whole colonial endeavor. So these ideas became very, very, very popular. Now, of course, what happened was that up till the Second World War, you had very sort of open colonization taking place. Okay, but after the Second World War, there was a distinct shift where the idea of actually keeping colonies fell out of favor. Okay, so this led to a wave, in fact, from after the Second World War up till the 70s, 1970s, there was a spate of countries that underwent the decolonization process, where the colonial power, gave up this kind of official, physical, direct control over the territory of the colony. Okay, so what came up in place was a shift. You remember we started out with imperialism to colonialism, but then from colonialism again there was a shift to imperialism. From this, in this wave of decolonization, what occurs is that the erstwhile colonial power gives up that physical control, but very often the imperial relationship still continues. Okay, so for instance, on the eve of independence, what many of these decolonized nations were facing was that the colonial power gives up their control. They say, okay, now you're an independent country. At some point, also they have a plan in place saying we are going to exit our forces, etc., from your country. But at the same time, they had great influence in the economy and on the trade and political front over the ex-colonies, right? So they could still negotiate because trade links continued. So they could still negotiate for the price of free raw material and say, okay, that iron ore which we used to take, extract from you, now we will import it from you because now you've become an independent nation, but this is going to be the price and we are going to set the price. Okay, so so it's important for us to understand that there was a huge kind of 20-30 year period where many of the ex-colonies became liberated. That's referred to as decolonization, but very often that imperial link still continued and took a while for that to break, if it ever did. And so that shift from colonial control back to imperial control is what is referred to as neocolonization. Okay, now a last term that we need to be aware of before we end the segment is that of post-colonialism. Now, post-colonialism essentially refers to the effect of colonialism in a country before and after the colonizing power departs. Okay, so as this example of, as these two concepts of decolonization and neocolonization should tell you, when a country is kept as a colony, when it experiences that kind of a colonial power exerted on it, it's not as if the colonial power, the effects of that experience of colonialism end on the day that it experienced independence, right? It exists before that and even for many years after that. We took the example of the Indian Administrative Service, a very key feature of how India is administered, which has its roots in our British colonial experience. Okay, so therefore this has actually led to a whole field of study called post-colonialism, where they look at this impact both before and after the country ceases to be a colony. Um, and In fact, it has become a very sort of influential, at one point it became a very influential field of study.